I smoothed the corners of my black dress in the mirror that morning, telling myself I could be strong for just one more day. My husband was gone, and my son had promised we would spend the afternoon together, just the two of us, so I clung to that fragile hope. I even packed a small bag, thinking maybe we would go somewhere quiet where grief could breathe without judgment. Before I continue, this is only the beginning of my story about loss, betrayal, and unexpected strength. Tell me, have you ever been surprised by the people you trusted most? And where are you watching from right now? And if you want to hear stories that feel like pieces of your own life, subscribe now, because the next chapter may echo something you have lived. But when we pulled into the parking lot, my hope unraveled. The sign read Maplewood Senior Shelter. He told me gently that it was for my own good. Then he pressed my bag into my lap, whispered that he would come back soon, and drove away before I could even find my voice. I never imagined that a ride with my son on that gray afternoon would end with me standing on the steps of a shelter, clutching a bag that suddenly felt like it carried not only clothes but also the weight of my entire life. The sound of his car tires fading away seemed to echo louder than the traffic on the street. I stood frozen for a while, staring at the glass doors with their fading paint and taped notices, wondering if stepping inside meant accepting that this was all I was worth now. The woman at the front desk gave me a polite smile, but her tone was brisk, as if she had said the same words 100 times before. Name?
Age.
Any medical concerns? She asked while typing into a computer. I answered automatically, my voice quiet, almost as if I did not want to disturb the air. She slid me a clipboard and told me someone would show me my room shortly. Room. The word cut into me. It was not home. It was not the space I had built with my husband through years of sacrifice and small triumphs. It was a place to sleep, nothing more. A young staff member walked me down a long corridor. The walls were painted beige, but the paint peeled near the baseboards. Doors lined both sides, each one with a small number. When we stopped at mine, she handed me a key and explained the dining schedule. Meals at 7, noon, and 5. Lights out by 9. Visitors only on weekends if arranged in advance. I nodded, though my heart was not in the conversation. I stepped into the room and saw a single bed, a desk pressed against the wall, and a closet that smelled faintly of dust. I sat on the edge of the bed, my bag still clutched in my lap. For years, I had imagined the time after my husband's passing would be filled with quiet mornings in the kitchen, maybe coffee with neighbors, or reading by the window. I never pictured a bare room in a shelter. I wanted to cry, but the tears would not come. Instead, I looked around and tried to breathe. That is when my eyes landed on the desk. It looked oddly familiar, its surface scratched in the same places I remembered from our old house. When I pulled open the drawer, I found it empty except for a small lock fixed to the inside panel. I reached into my bag. Before leaving the house that morning, I had swept a handful of keys from my husband's desk into my purse without really thinking about it. One of them was old, its brass dull and worn smooth from years of use. Something inside me stirred, and I tried it in the lock. With a soft click, the drawer opened. Inside, tied with a piece of faded string, was a stack of envelopes. My breath caught as I lifted them out. The paper was yellowed around the edges, the handwriting instantly familiar. My husband had always written in careful block letters, neat and steady. My hands trembled as I untied the string. The first envelope was addressed to me in his hand. I unfolded the letter slowly. The words blurred at first, tears filling my eyes before I could even begin. When I wiped them away, I read, "My dearest, if you are holding this, it means I am no longer there to say what I should have said more often. I am sorry for the times I left you to carry burdens alone. I am sorry if you ever felt unseen. I want you to know I thought of you every day. I knew there might come a time when others would try to decide for you, to treat you as if you were fragile or finished. Please do not let them. I left something behind to protect you. You will find it soon. And when you do, remember that it was not meant to bind you, but to free you." I sat there for what felt like hours, reading the lines again and again. It felt like hearing his voice in the room, calm and steady, just as it had been when he reassured me through every trial of our marriage. I pressed the letter against my chest, whispering his name into the silence. Later that night, I slipped the rest of the envelopes back into the drawer, but I kept that first letter beside me on the bed. The shelter noises carried through the thin walls, coughs, footsteps, a television from another room. Yet for the first time since my son had driven away, I did not feel entirely abandoned. The words on that paper reached across the distance between life and death and reminded me that I was still worth something, that I was not just an old woman to be tucked away. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the times my husband had told me not to worry about money. He used to say, "Trust me, I have plans." At the time, I assumed he meant little things, like fixing the roof or paying off bills. Now, holding that letter, I began to wonder what he had really meant. What had he left? Where would I find it? The night stretched long, but in my chest I carried a flicker of curiosity, a spark of strength I thought had gone out when the funeral ended. Maybe tomorrow, I thought, I will open another envelope. Maybe tomorrow, the truth he left behind will begin to change everything. The next morning, I woke with the letter still folded under my pillow. The staff knocked to remind me about breakfast, but I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the desk across the room. Something inside me insisted that I had to see what else was in those envelopes. My son's words from the day before still hurt, but the memory of my husband's handwriting gave me the courage to sit at that desk again. When I opened the drawer, the stack of letters was exactly as I had left it, bound with string. I untied it carefully, as if rushing might cause the paper to crumble. The second envelope was thicker than the first. My hands shook as I pulled out several folded sheets along with something heavier, a document stamped with an insurance company's seal. I smoothed the first page flat. It was a policy statement, dated years ago, naming me as the sole beneficiary. The amount printed near the bottom nearly stopped my breath, $797,519. I read it twice, certain I had misread the numbers. But the ink was clear, the figures undeniable. My heart pounded as memories rushed back. I remember the years when he worked late shifts, coming home smelling of metal and grease. He used to brush off my questions about the overtime. "Just making sure we're secure," he would say with a tired smile. I thought he was only covering bills or saving for repairs. I never guessed he was quietly paying into something so substantial, protecting me in ways I could not have imagined. I reached for the letter tucked alongside the policy. His handwriting covered both sides of the page. "My love," it began, "I know how stubborn I can be when it comes to money. You used to say I held secrets in my pocket. You were right, though it was never meant to shut you out. It was meant to give you peace when I no longer could. This policy is for you. I kept it quiet not because I doubted you, but because I wanted you to have a safety net no one could touch. If anyone tries to make you feel small, remember these numbers. Remember that I trusted you with everything I had." I stopped reading halfway through, my vision blurred again. I pressed the page to my lips, whispering his name into the quiet. Even from the grave, he was standing between me and the world that had tried to discard me. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the desk, but I kept the policy in my lap. For years, I had believed we were just scraping by. I had sold jewelry at one point to cover medical bills, convinced that we were always one misstep from disaster. Now I realized that while I carried the visible burdens, he had been carrying a hidden one, making sure that my future would not collapse when he was gone. The thought filled me with both gratitude and sadness. Gratitude that he had cared enough to plan for me in such a concrete way. Sadness that he had never shared it with me while alive. I would have told him that money was not the only protection I needed. His presence had been my anchor. Still, his foresight now gave me a new kind of strength. Later that afternoon, I walked through the common area of the shelter. Some residents sat in silence. Others watched the muted television. I carried the envelope in my bag, its weight both comforting and intimidating. I thought of my son, of the way he had driven off without looking back. He had no idea this policy existed. To him, I was a burden. To my husband, I was still the center of his world, even in death. I returned to my room and sat again at the desk. My fingers lingered on the string around the remaining letters. I wanted to open them all at once, but something told me to take them slowly, one by one, like steps on a path. For now, it was enough to know that I was not powerless. I was not the helpless woman my son believed he could tuck away in a shelter and forget. As the day faded into evening, I thought back to the night we had signed the papers for our first house. The mortgage broker had pushed a stack of documents across the desk, and my husband had taken my hand as I signed. "This is our proof," he had whispered then, "that no matter how hard things get, we build together." Now, decades later, his words carried a new meaning. Even in silence, even after his death, he had been building a wall around me, one I could lean on when everyone else turned away. When the shelter lights dimmed for the night, I lay in bed and pulled the insurance document out once more. I studied the figures, trying to wrap my mind around them. That amount was not just security. It was freedom. It was the chance to choose where I would live, how I would spend the years left to me. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something close to power stirring in my chest. I whispered to the darkness, as if he could hear me still. "You kept your promise." And with that, I closed my eyes, holding the papers close, already planning the first steps of a future I thought had been stolen from me. When I woke the following day, I felt an unusual sense of clarity. The insurance papers and letters had not changed my surroundings, but they shifted something inside me. The shelter still looked the same, with beige walls and narrow hallways, yet I walked through it with a steadier step. I had spent the first days there in silence, waiting for someone to tell me what my life would be. Now, for the first time, I realized I still had choices. At breakfast, I noticed the other women at my table. Most kept their eyes down, spooning porridge without speaking. One woman coughed repeatedly, ignored by the staff walking past. Another stared at the wall, her hands folded tightly as if she were trying not to disappear. I understood their silence, but I also recognized something in myself that I had not allowed to surface before. My husband had left me the means to stand on my own. He had trusted me with more than I ever knew. That thought stayed with me as I carried my tray back and sat alone by the window. Back in my room, I opened the drawer again and pulled out another envelope. This one was shorter, only a single page. His words cut straight to the truth. "You carried us through times I could not handle. I know you think I was strong, but I watched you give up new shoes so our son could have football cleats. I saw you pack lunches from scraps while telling me you had already eaten. You thought I did not notice, but I did. And it broke me to let you do it. This money is not repayment, because nothing could equal what you gave. But I hope it gives you freedom, finally." I leaned back in the chair and let the paper rest on my lap. His words brought back a flood of memories I had almost buried. I remembered nights when bills sat in a neat pile on the kitchen table, and I ran my fingers over them as if touching them could shrink the numbers. I remembered skipping meals, telling my son I was not hungry, while the truth was that there was not enough for all three of us. My husband had worked, yes, but I had stretched every dollar until it tore at the seams. The letter reminded me of one particular winter. The pipes in the house froze, and we could not afford a plumber. I stood in the freezing kitchen, boiling kettles of water and pouring them carefully over the pipes, hour after hour, until they finally gave way. My hands were cracked and raw, but I still managed to cook dinner that evening. I never told anyone how exhausted I felt. That was just what mothers and wives did. Reading his acknowledgement of those hidden sacrifices cut me deeply, but also gave me a strange comfort. He had seen me. All those years when I thought my efforts went unnoticed, he had been paying attention. He carried his silence, but it was not ignorance. It was love, clumsy in its quietness. The insurance policy now took on a different meaning. It was not only about numbers on a page. It was his way of saying, "I remember everything you gave, and I want you to have something in return." It gave me a sense of validation I had been missing, especially after being left at the shelter, like an unwanted responsibility. As the day wore on, I thought more about what that money could mean. I could leave the shelter. I could buy a place where I belonged. For years, My son and his wife had hinted that I should move in with them, but those conversations always ended with small remarks about how much space I would take up, or how inconvenient it might be to adjust their routines. I realized now they never wanted me with them. They wanted what I owned. That was why leaving me at the shelter had been so easy. To them, I was a problem solved. To my husband, I was still worth protecting. Later that evening, I walked outside into the small garden behind the shelter. A few residents sat on benches, but most kept to themselves. I sat alone, the crisp air filling my lungs, and I whispered aloud, "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" I imagined my husband sitting beside me, the way he used to during our evening walks. He had not left me powerless. He had left me with the ability to start again. That night, before going to bed, I placed all the letters back into the drawer, except the one I had just read. I slid it under my pillow with the first letter, keeping them close like a shield. Lying there, I thought about the years ahead. For the first time, I allowed myself to picture a future not shaped by others' decisions. I could make choices for myself. I could decide where I lived, who I welcomed, and what kind of life I wanted. The shelter noises carried through the walls again, but they no longer felt as heavy. I was still here, yes, but I was not trapped. In my bag lay a document that could open doors my son never expected me to walk through. He had thought leaving me at Maplewood would be the end of my independence. Instead, it might be the beginning of something entirely different. I drifted asleep with that thought resting in my mind. Tomorrow, I decided I would begin to plan. The following week passed slowly, and every day I became more aware of how different the shelter was from the life I once knew. Breakfast trays arrived lukewarm, conversations at the tables were scarce, and most of the residents carried the same quiet resignation. I tried not to let it swallow me, but the contrast between what I held in my desk drawer and what surrounded me could not be ignored. I knew something had to change, though I was not yet sure how. One afternoon, the staff wheeled in a cart of folded laundry. The clothes smelled faintly of detergent, but they were stacked without care, shirts crumpled over pants. I picked up my pile and carried it back to my room. As I placed the folded pieces into the small closet, I caught sight of the old letters again, tucked neatly in the drawer. That drawer was beginning to feel like a secret lifeline, reminder that I was not like the others here, not because I was better, but because I had been left a chance to step outside of this place. That evening, I sat at the desk and opened another letter. His words were brief but sharp. "I worried often about how little I could give you in our early years. But you never complained. I saw you sit with bills late at night, whispering numbers under your breath, trying to make them stretch. You thought you hid it, but I saw. This is why I kept working late. I wanted to leave you something that made up for the nights you went without." The letter pulled me back into memory. I could see myself sitting at the kitchen table decades earlier, a small lamp casting light on envelopes spread across the surface. I had kept a notebook of expenses, each line carefully written. Rent, groceries, utilities, school supplies. I used to whisper the totals under my breath, hoping somehow the numbers would shrink if I said them softly enough. When I remembered those nights, I also remembered the quiet resolve I carried. I had never wanted my son to feel the weight of our struggles. Now, years later, that same son had placed me here, as if none of those sacrifices mattered. The thought stung, but it also pushed me to act. My husband had not left me money just to survive. He had left it so I could live with dignity. I pulled a notebook from my bag and began to write. At first, it was just scattered thoughts. What would it take to leave the shelter? Where would I go? Did I want to find a new house, or did I want to return to the old one? As the questions spilled onto the page, I found myself sketching rough plans. I wrote about neighborhoods I once admired, about the feel of walking into a home that smelled of wood polish and fresh paint. I wrote about gardens, kitchens, and the sound of doors that opened with a key that belonged only to me. The more I wrote, the clearer it became that I did not want to simply buy a place to live. I wanted to buy back my place in the world. For so long, my son and his wife had spoken about downsizing, about selling the house I had loved. They talked about it as if it were nothing more than a financial asset. They never spoke of the birthdays celebrated there, the winters endured by the fire, or the way my husband used to whistle while fixing the broken fence. To them, it was a thing to be converted into money. To me, it was a history. As I sat with my notebook, I remembered one winter evening when the furnace broke. My husband and I had huddled under blankets with our son, playing cards by candlelight. He was only 12, and he laughed when my husband pretended to shiver dramatically. We had no heat, but that night remains one of the warmest memories of my life. Those walls had held laughter as much as hardship, and I realized I was not ready to surrender them to anyone else. By the time the lights dimmed in the hallway, I had written 3 full pages of plans. They were not yet detailed, but they gave me direction. I knew I would call a lawyer soon. I knew I would take steps to use the money in a way that honored both my husband's sacrifices and my own. The next morning, I walked through the common area with a new steadiness. Some of the women looked at me curiously, as if they could sense I was carrying something unseen. In truth, I was. In my bag rested the insurance policy, folded carefully in an envelope, along with my growing notebook of plans. Every time I touched the papers, I felt my husband's presence. It was as if he was urging me forward, reminding me that he had trusted me to do what was right. Later that day, I returned again to the desk. I pulled out another letter, unable to resist. His words read, "I know you will carry grief when I am gone, but I pray you do not carry only that. Carry also the knowledge that I saw everything you gave, and I wanted to give back. Please promise me you will not let others decide your place in the world. Promise me you will claim it yourself." I set the paper down slowly. Promise. That word stayed with me. I had made promises before, to raise our son well, to hold our marriage through difficulty, to protect our home. Now it was time to make one more promise, this time to myself. I would not allow the betrayal of being left at the shelter to define the last chapter of my life. I would claim something back, even if it took all the strength I had left. That night, I slept more soundly than I had since arriving. My future was no longer just a blur of empty days. I could see steps forming, even if small, and I knew each letter waiting in that drawer would continue to guide me forward. By the 3rd week, the routines of the building had settled into my muscles, yet one habit kept my pulse awake at night and first thing in the morning. I kept returning to the drawer, to the bundle of envelopes that smelled faintly of paper and time, as if the past had its own kind of air. Breakfast lines, medication carts, lights-out reminders, all of it moved around me, but those pages were the part of the day I chose for myself. I waited until the hallway quieted after lunch before I sat at the desk again. The chair rocked a little, its back loose, and for a second I pictured my husband kneeling with a screwdriver, fixing it without a word. I untied the string and selected the next envelope by touch, not order. The seal had already lifted on one corner, as if it had been waiting for this exact afternoon. He had written about a December I had tried to forget. He described the way the kitchen faucet dripped into a bowl because we were saving for a replacement. He remembered how I kept a small notebook in my apron pocket and wrote down every grocery item before I pushed the cart. He admitted he was afraid we might not make it that winter, and that he had started the policy then, cutting back in places I never saw so that I would not have to cut as deep. Reading that, I set the sheet down and inhaled slowly until my throat opened again. The letter brought up a scene I had not let myself revisit. Our son was in middle school and needed a uniform for a school trip. The deadline had crept up. I had already sold a pair of earrings for my mother to cover a doctor bill that month. I remember standing at the pawn shop counter with my wedding set in my hand and choosing not to let it go, promising I would find another way. That night I skipped dinner and told my boy I had eaten earlier. He never knew. The trip was paid on time. I folded the page and reached for the next one because stopping would have left the ache lodged in my chest with nowhere to go. This letter was different. He wrote about our son as a man, about small moments that had worried him long before either of us wanted to admit they mattered. He mentioned the first time our son suggested we downsize, how he used practical words while ignoring the memories inside the walls. He noted the way our daughter-in-law had started calling the house a burden. He did not blame them. He wrote that people get used to comfort and forget how it was built. He asked me to promise I would not hand over what held our life together simply because someone sounded certain. I set that page beside the first. The room's thin window let in street noise and a slice of pale light. The staff will squeaked past. In the next room, someone coughed. Ordinary sounds. Inside my head, a different kind of sound grew, the firm one I used to hear when we faced bills together. It told me to keep reading until I knew what he had wanted me to know. The third envelope of the day carried a few lines that felt like a hand on my shoulder. He said he had started keeping copies of statements in a separate file, that the policy would be easy to claim if I walked in with identification and the papers from the drawer. He told me to take someone with me if I did not feel steady, not because I was weak but because it helps to have a witness in rooms where people speak in quick terms. I ran a finger along the margins. The calm in his voice carried across years and steadied me better than sleep. I closed my eyes and pictured the first job I took after our son went to college. It was nights at a bakery packing orders. The pay barely covered utilities, but it gave the house another month each time we needed it. I used to come home with flour on my sleeves, and my husband would meet me at the door with a damp towel and a plate of toast. We never talked about being tired because talking would have turned it into something heavier than either of us could lift. We just kept going. Sitting at that desk now, I understood that the insurance had been his way of keeping that doorway ritual alive. He could not hand me a towel anymore. He could still make sure there was heat and a key that opened my own front door. A knock at the frame made me start. One of the residents, a woman with a stitched hem and sharp eyes, stood there with a deck of worn cards. She asked if I wanted to join a game later. I told her maybe, and thanked her by name even though we had only spoken twice before. When she left, I realized I had been isolating myself more than I knew. The letters had pulled me inward. I needed them, but I also needed to remember I was not the only person in this hallway trying to hang on to a sense of self. I put the envelopes back and took my notebook from the bag. On a clean page, I wrote a list without numbers. Call the insurance office. Ask for the claim process. Find a lawyer who will listen. Schedule an appointment to see the old house. Each line settled me. I wrote another line. Do not explain any of this to my son until I am ready. That last one felt heavy and right at the same time. As evening settled, I went outside to the small garden. A man from the men's wing watered a row of planters the volunteers kept alive. He hummed under his breath. I sat on the bench and counted the breaths it took for the day to ease out of my shoulders. I thought about the first mortgage again and the way my husband had kept our hands together on the pen as we signed, as if our names needed both of us to hold them steady. He had known our boy might grow into a man who saw value in different ways. He had planned for me to withstand that. The planning did not make the hurt vanish, but it made it bearable. The garden lights clicked on. I went back inside and found 2 staff members putting up a notice near the dining room about a flu clinic. One of them waved and asked if I needed anything. I almost said I needed my life back. Instead, I said I was fine. In my room, I washed my face, made the bed tight, and placed the 3 letters I had read into a neat stack beneath the first 2. Then I did something I had not done since I arrived. I called the number on the policy and listened to the recorded menu all the way through without hanging up. When a person finally answered, I introduced myself and asked for instructions. The representative spoke clearly. She told me exactly which forms to bring and how long the first meeting would take. I wrote every detail down, thanked her, and ended the call with my hand shaking in the best possible way. I could not sleep right away, so I let my mind drift forward and backward in small loops. I saw myself at the kitchen table with a stack of envelopes and a pencil. I saw myself at a different table with a pen and documents that would move money meant for a widow into accounts with my name. I saw the front step of the old house, the one where our son had taken his first day of school picture, the one where my husband had stood with a paintbrush grinning like a boy when he finally finished the trim. I asked myself what it would feel like to put a key into that lock again and not ask anyone's permission. The question filled my lungs better than the air conditioning ever had. Before lights out, I wrote a short message to myself on an index card and slid it under the string around the envelopes. 3 sentences only. You are not a problem to be managed. You have the proof in your hands. Move. I did not need flowery words. I needed directions I could follow when fear tried to talk louder than common sense. When I finally slept, It came without the dull ache that had sat at the back of my head since the funeral. In the quiet before dawn, I woke with a certainty I had not felt in years. He had seen the road before me. He had placed signs where I could not miss them. I would follow them until my feet crossed a threshold I chose. In the morning, I was at the front desk before most residents stirred. Asked for a printout of the bus routes. I asked about visitor hours for weekday appointments. I made a note to find a place to store my few things safely once I started moving through the steps. Back in my room, I dressed, folded the policy into my bag, and left the letters in the drawer like coals in a stove, still giving off heat even when I stepped away. The morning after calling the insurance office, I walked to the bus stop with my bag pressed close to my side. The shelter staff gave me a curious look when I signed out for the day, but they didn't ask questions. I hadn't ridden the city bus in years, and climbing the steps felt like stepping back into a younger version of myself. I sat near the window, the policy tucked into a folder on my lap, and reminded myself to breathe evenly. It was just a meeting. Still, I knew it was more than that. It was the first real move toward changing everything. The ride downtown was slow, the bus stopping at corners where students climbed in with backpacks and workers held their coffee cups tight. I watched them and wondered if any of them could imagine what sat in my folder, how much of a life was tied up in those numbers. The building I needed was tall, glass windows catching the light, nothing like the narrow hallway I had slept in the night before. My hands shook a little as I pushed through the revolving doors. At the reception desk, a woman asked my name and appointment time. When she directed me to the waiting area, I sat on a couch that felt too soft after the stiff shelter mattress. I clutched the folder and whispered in my head the same words my husband had written. "You are not a problem to be managed. You have the proof in your hands. Move." The meeting itself was slower than I imagined. A man in a gray suit asked for my identification and flipped through the pages. He spoke in careful terms, outlining the process, the verification steps, the timeline for release of funds. I nodded at the right places and kept my back straight. Inside, I felt like I was hearing a language I once thought belonged to other people. Yet when he slid a signature page across the desk, I picked up the pen without hesitation. I had signed dozens of contracts in my life, mortgages, car loans, school forms. This time, the signature was not for debt. It was for freedom. Afterward, I stepped out onto the sidewalk and let the air fill my chest. The city moved around me with horns and footsteps, but I felt rooted in place, as if I had reclaimed something invisible. I knew it would take weeks for the claim to process, but it was already real in my mind. I had started. On the bus ride back, I thought of the letters again. My husband had warned me not to let others decide my place in the world. I saw now that he had been preparing me for this exact day. He must have known that grief would leave me vulnerable, that family could twist practicality into control. But he had left tools sharper than their words. When I returned to my room, I opened the drawer again. I wanted another letter. This one began, "If you are reading this, you are probably tired. I wish I were there to tell you that you have already done more than enough. But there is one thing left I ask of you. Do not let what we built be swallowed by someone else's plans. Remember, our house is not just boards and paint. It is proof. If you walk away from it by choice, I will understand. If you give it up because someone forced you, I will not rest easy." I closed my eyes and let his words sink into me. Proof. That word echoed. The house wasn't just shelter. It was the story of every struggle we survived. My son and his wife had treated it like a transaction, but my husband saw it as the record of our life. Reading those lines, I realized the direction my steps needed to take. The money would give me options, but the house was more than an option. It was a vow. I thought back to the first time our son called it too much space. We had been at Sunday dinner. He had leaned back in his chair and said the upkeep was wasteful, that I should consider something smaller. His wife agreed, saying she knew a realtor who could help. I had laughed it off then, trying not to notice the way they spoke as though the decision was already theirs. That memory burned hotter now. They had been planning my absence for longer than I wanted to admit. As the evening settled, I walked outside to the small garden. A few residents smoked near the fence, their voices low. I sat alone and pulled my notebook from my bag. On the page I wrote, "Visit the house. See if it still feels like mine." Under that I wrote, "Do not tell them." Then I added, "Promise kept." I slipped the notebook back and looked up at the dimming sky. For the first time since arriving at the shelter, I felt the stirrings of anticipation rather than dread. I was no longer waiting for others to decide what would happen. I was preparing to move in the direction my husband had already laid out for me. Back in my room, I placed the new letter beneath the others and laid my folder of documents on top of them. I smoothed the stack flat, like setting bricks into place. Then I whispered aloud to the empty space, "I hear you. I won't let them take what we built." That night, I fell asleep quickly, my notebook under the pillow, the policy in my bag, and the letters in the drawer. My husband's voice had carried me again, not as memory, but as instruction. I knew where I had to go next, and for the first time in weeks, the thought of tomorrow did not weigh me down. It lifted me. The following Saturday, I stood at the edge of the street where our old house sat, clutching my bag tighter than I meant to. The bus had dropped me 2 blocks away, and I walked slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the sight of the familiar neighborhood. The air smelled faintly of cut grass, just like it used to when my husband pushed the mower in the evenings after work. My heart raced as the house came into view. The same brick walls, but with new curtains in the windows. I had prepared myself for the changes, but still, seeing someone else's life spilling through the glass stirred something raw inside me. I paused at the gate, remembering how many times I had pushed it open with grocery bags in my hands or watched my son run through it on his way to school. For years this had been the frame of my daily life, the first thing I saw in the morning, and the last thing I closed at night. Now it looked smaller, as though my memories had made it larger than it really was. I didn't go inside. That would have required explanations I wasn't ready to give. Instead, I stood at the sidewalk, staring at the walls that had held birthdays, arguments, reconciliations, and late-night whispers with my husband when the world felt too heavy. A woman stepped out onto the porch, watering a line of potted plants. She gave me a polite smile, and I returned it, hiding the flood of memories pressing against me. I walked slowly around the block and sat on a bench across the street. From there I could see the upstairs window that had once been my son's room. I remembered standing in that doorway, watching him fall asleep with books scattered across his blanket. I remembered the year he begged for new sneakers, and I worked a double shift to make sure he had them in time for picture day. He had once told me he would never leave me behind. Sitting there now, I let the weight of those words sink in. The letter from my husband echoed in my mind. Do not let what we built be swallowed by someone else's plans. He had known. Maybe not the exact details, but he had sensed that one day our son would value the house for its worth on paper rather than the life it carried. That realization cut deep, yet it also steadied me. I wasn't imagining betrayal. It had been unfolding quietly for years. I pulled out my notebook and began to write. On one page, I listed memories: Christmas mornings by the fire, my husband's laughter while fixing the leaky sink, the smell of cinnamon rolls that filled the kitchen on Sundays. On the next page, I wrote what had been lost: respect, acknowledgement, gratitude. The comparison made me tremble. The house had been both cradle and shield, but my son had treated it like a prize waiting to be claimed. After a while, I stood and began walking again, circling the neighborhood one last time. I noticed the mailbox where my husband used to tuck folded notes for me, silly drawings he made on scrap paper after long shifts. I noticed the sidewalk cracks we had patched together with cheap cement. Every corner carried a story. Leaving the block felt like leaving a cemetery, but I told myself I wasn't saying goodbye. Not yet. When I returned to the shelter later that afternoon, I went straight to the drawer and pulled out another letter. My hand shook as I opened it, as if my husband had known I would need his voice most after seeing the house again. His words read, "If you are standing in front of our home and it no longer feels safe, remind yourself it is not the walls that give you strength. It is you." The house was only ever a mirror of what you carried inside. Do not grieve it as though it is gone forever. You have the right to claim space anywhere you stand. Tears blurred the page, but I forced myself to finish reading. If our son forgets the work that built those walls, then he is forgetting part of himself too. That is his burden to carry, not yours. Do not let guilt stop you from choosing what comes next. I pressed the paper to my chest. It was as if he had walked with me that morning, had seen the porch, the curtains, the new plants, and had spoken directly into my ear. The house might no longer belong to me physically, but the memories it held were not transferable. They were mine, and no deed or sale could take them away. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying the sight of my son's old window, remembering his boyish laughter, and then hearing his adult voice telling me to let go of the past. The contradiction nearly tore me in two. But then I thought again of the policy waiting to be processed, the money my husband had secured without my knowledge, and I realized what had to be done. If I could not return to the house we once shared, I would build another space, one that reflected the life I chose now. The next morning, I sat at the desk again and wrote another list in my notebook. At the top, I wrote, "Find a house of my own." Beneath it, I wrote, "Large enough for visitors, quiet enough for peace, close enough to town so I can manage on my own." I did not need extravagance. I needed security, walls that were mine alone, a key that no one else could claim. By the time the hallway lights dimmed, I felt a steadiness I hadn't known in months. Visiting the old house had been painful, but it had given me clarity. My son might think he had closed a chapter by placing me in a shelter, but the truth was that a new one had just begun. When the insurance office called to confirm that my claim was officially processing, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't the money itself yet, but the certainty that it would arrive. That phone call shifted something inside me. I no longer felt like a guest waiting out my days in a borrowed bed. I felt like a woman preparing to leave. The next step was practical. I asked one of the shelter staff for help locating a realtor in town. She handed me a community paper and circled a few names. That night I sat at the desk, going through the listings. The numbers looked strange at first, columns of square footage and price tags, but I reminded myself that I had navigated harder figures before. Mortgage bills, grocery ledgers, late fees. This time the numbers weren't stacked against me. They were opening a door. I picked 3 homes to start with. Nothing extravagant. One was a small single-story with a narrow porch. Another was a brick house not far from the bus line. The third was older, needing repairs, but had a small yard. I wasn't sure which would be right, but simply making the list gave me energy I hadn't felt in years. That weekend, the realtor met me at the first property. She was young, her shoes clicking confidently on the pavement, but she treated me with respect. She didn't look through me the way some people did at the shelter. She handed me the key, let me open the door myself, and waited as I stepped into the empty rooms. The smell of fresh paint hit me first, sharp and clean. I walked slowly, touching the window frames, the light switches, the edges of the counters. Each small detail mattered. I imagined where I would place the table, how a chair might look by the window, what it would feel like to turn the lock at night, knowing no one could decide I didn't belong. The second home had a sturdier feel, older walls that carried weight. The kitchen was smaller, but the back door opened into a quiet yard with space for a small garden. I stood there for a long time, picturing rows of herbs and flowers, the kind of simple work that steadies the hands. The realtor asked if I wanted to see the upstairs. I told her yes, but my mind stayed outside with the soil. The third house was less polished, with peeling paint on the trim and floors that creaked when I walked. Yet I felt something stir as I moved from room to room. This house carried history. I could see past the wear to the shape of what it could be. It reminded me of the house my husband and I had first moved into, when nothing was finished, but everything was possible. That night, back at the shelter, I wrote notes on each property in my notebook. The first house felt new, but impersonal. The second offered comfort, and that yard I could already see myself working in. The third carried echoes of the past, the kind that made me feel both sad and alive. I didn't decide yet. I told myself I would wait until the insurance check arrived before choosing, but in truth my heart leaned toward the second. The other residents began noticing changes in me. One woman asked why I carried a folder everywhere. Another commented that I smiled more. I didn't tell them everything, but I shared pieces. I said I was working on starting over. I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, and it reminded me that not everyone here was waiting to fade. Some of us were just waiting for a chance. A few days later, I opened another letter from my husband. This one was shorter, almost a note. He wrote, "If you are searching for another place, choose one that makes you breathe easier. Don't pick what looks impressive to others. Pick what feels like home to you, even if no one else understands why. You gave years making everyone else comfortable. Now it's your turn." Those words settled the matter in my mind. I didn't need grandeur. I needed peace. A garden, a kitchen I could move in, a bedroom where I could wake without fear of being pushed aside. The second house was beginning to look more and more like the answer. In the days that followed, I visited it again. The realtor unlocked the door and left me alone to walk through at my own pace. I stood in the living room, closing my eyes, hearing the echoes of laughter from years ago. Not the old laughter from the house I had lost, but the kind I imagined could grow here. I pictured friends around the table, maybe even some of the women from the shelter, who needed a place to feel welcome. The idea warmed me more than I expected. Returning to the shelter that evening was harder. The hallways seemed narrower, the meals blander. My room felt even smaller than before. But instead of despair, I felt restless. It was the kind of restlessness that comes before change. I knew now that I wasn't waiting to see if life would shift. I was preparing to move it with my own hands. That night, I wrote a simple sentence at the bottom of my notebook. "Soon this will be behind me." I placed the notebook back in the drawer beside the letters, folded the policy over it, and closed the drawer with care. For the first time, I believed those words. The morning the insurance check arrived, I held the envelope for several minutes before opening it. My name was typed neatly on the front, and for a moment I traced the letters with my finger, almost disbelieving that it truly belonged to me. When I tore it open and saw the numbers printed clearly, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. All the waiting, all the paperwork, all the silent prayers to my husband as I read his letters, it had led to this piece of paper. I tucked it into my folder and took the bus downtown again, this time with a stronger stride. The teller at the bank guided me through the deposit, asking if I wanted to place it into a savings account or check. My voice shook slightly as I said I wanted immediate access, explaining that I was preparing to purchase a home. She smiled and nodded, typing on her keyboard without judgment. When the transaction was complete, I left with a receipt and the knowledge that I finally had the means to step out of the shelter. The next call was to the realtor. I told her I was ready to make an offer on the second house, the one with the small garden that had stayed in my mind like a promise. She scheduled the paperwork for the following day. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I lay awake in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining the sound of keys in my hand, the weight of ownership pressing into my palm. The signing process felt almost unreal. Sitting across from the realtor at a polished desk, I watched her slide document after document toward me. I read each line carefully, though my hands trembled slightly with every signature. Unlike the contracts I had signed in the past, this wasn't tied to struggle or debt. This was mine outright, a purchase born of foresight and sacrifice. I thought of my husband's long shifts, the letters tucked away in the drawer, and my own years of endurance. Each stroke of my pen felt like sealing that history into something solid. When it was finished, the realtor handed me the keys. Cold, small pieces of metal rested in my hand, yet they felt heavier than anything I had held in years. I slipped them into my bag, holding back tears until I stepped outside. The air smelled like possibility. I walked to the bus stop with my folder pressed against my chest, keys hidden inside, but my whole body knew they were there. The first night in the new house, I didn't bring much. Just a small suitcase, my notebook, and the stack of letters. I placed the letters on the kitchen counter, smoothed them gently, and whispered to my husband, "We did it." The rooms echoed with emptiness, but it was my emptiness, not someone else's. I spread a blanket on the floor and lay down, smiling at the silence that belonged only to me. It didn't take long for my son to find out. 2 weeks later, as I was carrying in groceries, he pulled up in his car. He stepped out quickly, his face tight with disbelief. His wife sat in the passenger seat, arms folded, her eyes scanning the house like it was something stolen from them. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice louder than the quiet street deserved. I stood steady, holding the grocery bag against my hip. "This is my home," I said calmly. He looked at me as if I had spoken another language.
How?
"You had nothing. We left you at the shelter because you couldn't manage on your own. How could you afford this?" His words stung, but they also gave me strength. I set the groceries down on the porch and pulled the keys from my pocket, letting them jingle lightly. "Your father planned for me. He left enough for me to stand on my own 2 feet. You thought I had nothing, but you were wrong." His wife's face paled, her lips pressing tight. My son shook his head, muttering, "You should have told me. We could have handled it for you." I met his eyes and spoke with a steadiness I didn't know I still carried. "That's exactly why I didn't tell you. Because this wasn't meant for you to handle. It was meant for me." The silence between us stretched. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at his wife, who avoided my eyes. I could see the frustration in both of them, not just because I had surprised them, but because I had taken control of something they thought was theirs. I picked up my groceries and opened the door. Before stepping inside, I turned back. "Your father and I built our lives with sacrifice you will never fully understand. He trusted me to protect what we built, and I've kept that trust. You may not agree, but this house is mine, and I don't need anyone's approval to live here." I closed the door gently, but firmly. Inside, I leaned against it, letting my breath steady. The confrontation had left me shaken, but it also filled me with relief. The truth was out. I didn't need to hide anymore. My husband's plan had worked. I had reclaimed my dignity, and no one could strip it away again. That night, I sat at the kitchen counter, unfolded the next letter, and read it slowly. He had written, "If they ever question you, remember that you owe no one an explanation. You carried this family through storms they don't even remember.
Standtal.
Stand alone if you must. And know that I am proud of you." I pressed the letter flat against the counter, tears blurring the words. I whispered into the silence, "I'm standing, just like you asked." The days after my son's visit were strangely quiet. The confrontation had shaken me, yet it also left me with a sense of calm I hadn't known in years. For once, the truth was no longer hidden. They knew I had the means to stand on my own, and I no longer had to explain or defend myself. Each morning I woke up in my new home, sunlight slipping through the curtains, and felt the difference between being placed somewhere and choosing to be somewhere. I began with small routines. I swept the kitchen floor, even though there wasn't much dust. I organized my groceries in the cupboards, making neat rows like I used to when my son was a boy. I planted 2 pots of herbs on the windowsill, not because I needed them, but because watching something grow under my care reminded me of who I had always been. Neighbors started to notice me. A woman from 2 houses down brought over a loaf of bread one afternoon, introducing herself and asking if I needed anything. I thanked her, and though part of me hesitated to open up, I offered her tea at the small table I had just set up. We sat together for an hour, talking about the block, about her children, and about the small garden out back. It felt natural, not forced. For the first time in a long while, I felt like part of a community rather than a burden hidden away. Each evening, I returned to the letters. They had become a rhythm, guiding me through this transition. One of them read, "If you have found a place to call your own, make it alive. Don't let it be a silent shelter. Fill it with sound, with meals, with visitors if you want them. Make it yours not just by deed, but by choice." I listened. I started cooking again, not just for myself, but for others. When the neighbor returned my empty plate, I sent her home with soup. The next week, she came back with pie. Soon, I found myself exchanging dishes with 2 other families nearby. My kitchen filled with conversation, and my table was no longer empty. I thought often of my husband as I moved through these new routines. The smell of onions sizzling in the pan, the sound of the kettle on the stove, these ordinary sounds connected me to him. They reminded me that I wasn't just surviving, I was continuing the life we had built together in a new space. I still missed him fiercely, but his absence no longer left me frozen. His letters had carried me across the hardest parts of grief, and now his words lived in the walls of this house. One afternoon, I stood in the garden with dirt on my hands, planting a row of flowers. The sun was warm, and for a moment I felt a strange rush of gratitude. Months ago, I had been left at a shelter with nothing but a bag of clothes. My son had believed he was closing a chapter on me, yet here I was, writing a new one on my own terms. The flowers weren't just decoration. They were proof that I had taken what was meant to be my ending and turned it into a beginning. Still, there were hard days. Sometimes at night, I replayed my son's words, the way he had told me I couldn't manage on my own. The sting of that betrayal didn't fade quickly. But each time it rose in my chest, I reminded myself of the key in my pocket, the deed with my name, and the quiet pride I felt when I looked around the rooms I had chosen. His opinion no longer defined me. The final letter came weeks later, tucked at the bottom of the stack. It was shorter than the rest, almost like a farewell. If you've reached this one, then you've carried out more than I could have hoped. You've proven to yourself what I always knew. You were the strength behind everything we built. Whatever comes next, don't forget that you have already done enough. Live in peace. That is all I ever wanted for you. I held that letter for a long time, reading it again and again. It felt like closing a circle. He had left me not just money, but a path. I had walked it, step by step, until I stood where he had hoped I would, independent, steady, and unafraid. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun went down, watching the street grow quiet. I thought about the shelter, about the women I had met there, and how many of them still sat in those narrow rooms, waiting for a chance. I wondered if I could invite one of them here, not to live permanently but to share a meal, to remind them that there was more waiting beyond those walls. The idea grew in me like a seed. Maybe this house wasn't just for me. Maybe it could be a place of rest for others, even for a night. As I closed my notebook that night, I realized I no longer felt like a woman discarded. I felt like someone who had claimed her story back. My son might never understand, but that no longer mattered. I had honored my husband, I had honored myself, and I had chosen a life beyond what anyone else believed for me. The house was quiet when I turned off the lights, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full of memory, of possibility, and of peace. Sometimes the hardest part of life is realizing that the people we raised, the ones we trusted, can look at us and see only what they want to take.
But strength is not given by them.
It's found in the quiet moments when we choose ourselves. This story was not about money or property. It was about reclaiming dignity, about proving that independence has no expiration date, and about honoring the sacrifices that built our lives. If you've ever felt unseen or dismissed as though your worth could be signed away, let this be a reminder. You are still the author of your story. You hold the keys, even when others try to write the ending for you. But what happens when betrayal doesn't come in private, but right in the middle of grief, in front of family and neighbors? When someone whispers a plan to take what is yours before the dirt has even settled. That's a story you won't want to miss, and it's waiting for you right here.